The halls of Brussels echoed with laughter whenever Traoré's name was mentioned. Officials smirked at the idea that a young captain from Burkina Faso could bend the will of a continent that had been chained for centuries by European influence. In their polished rooms, filled with gold-framed maps and centuries-old arrogance, they convinced themselves that Africa would never break free, that Traoré's fiery words were nothing more than tribal noise meant for restless crowds. They drafted reports calling his defiance a temporary disruption, predicting he would be swept aside like countless others who rose against them. They forgot that this was not the age of silent submission, this was the age of uprising, and every speech Traoré delivered carried the voice of millions who had tasted humiliation and were ready to fight for dignity. The EU treated his warnings as comedy, describing him as a hot-headed soldier playing at statesmanship, unable to grasp the complexity of global politics. They spoke with the language of superiority, convinced that their aid packages, their military programs, and their control over trade routes gave them eternal power over West Africa. In their minds, Burkina Faso was too small, too dependent, too weak to challenge them. They underestimated not only the will of one man, but the awakening of a people who no longer sought their approval. Their arrogance blinded them to the fact that history had turned, and the balance of power was slipping silently through their hands. Every decision Traoré made, expelling foreign troops, nationalizing resources, rejecting Western dictates, was mocked in Brussels as unsustainable. They whispered that he would run out of funds, that his army would fracture, that his people would eventually beg for European assistance again. They laughed in the shadows of their parliament halls, sipping wine, believing the old chains still held strong. What they could not see was that Traoré was not building his strength on their structures, he was tearing those structures down brick by brick. While they mocked, he organized. While they ridiculed, he united. While they dismissed him, he built alliances that were invisible to the arrogant eye. The EU's arrogance was not simply ignorance, it was a weapon sharpened by centuries of colonial dominance, the belief that they defined reality. They failed to notice that the ground beneath them was shaking, that their own citizens were questioning the cost of endless interventions in Africa, that African youth were chanting Traoré's name in cities they had never even visited. To the EU, Burkina Faso was an afterthought, but to the people of Africa, it had become a symbol, a flag planted in the soil declaring enough was enough. Their mistake was treating symbolism as weakness, when in truth, symbolism is the spark that ignites revolutions. As Traoré grew in stature, the EU's smirks turned to whispered debates, but still they refused to acknowledge the storm. They told themselves he was reckless, that time would expose his limits, that he was only riding a wave of temporary anger. Yet every step he took made that wave larger, stronger, more uncontainable. They did not understand that Traoré's defiance was not personal ambition, it was collective destiny. His voice carried the anger of Mali, the courage of Niger, the pride of Ghana, the longing of Congo. He was speaking a language older than their treaties, older than their parliaments, a language of liberation. By mocking him, the EU revealed its deepest weakness. It could not imagine a world where Africa no longer played by European rules. They continued to host conferences about development while Africa was already developing its own path. They continued to design strategies of control while control itself was slipping through their fingers. Their laughter became the fuel for Traoré's rise, because every time they belittled him, he became more authentic to his people. He was no longer seen as negotiating with colonial powers, he was seen as rejecting them, and in that rejection lay the strength of his revolution. The EU failed to realize that power is not measured only in weapons and money, but in legitimacy, and legitimacy was abandoning them rapidly. Africans no longer looked to Europe as the source of answers, they looked inward, they looked to leaders like Traoré who spoke with fire and acted with courage. Legitimacy cannot be bought with aid, it cannot be forced with troops, it cannot be tricked with treaties. Legitimacy comes when people see a leader willing to bleed with them, and Traoré embodied that spirit completely. The EU dismissed him as a populist, but populism in Africa was not a game, it was survival, it was truth, it was the rising tide they could not stop. Their arrogance turned to unease as intelligence reports showed his popularity growing even beyond his borders. European analysts warned that if his movement spread, the EU's strategic grip on West Africa would collapse. Yet politicians still mocked, unwilling to believe that a landlocked country could hold such leverage. They could not comprehend that the strength of an idea travels faster than the reach of an army. They ignored that the continent's youth, the largest demographic force in the world, saw in Traoré a mirror of their own struggle. And once a generation embraces a symbol, no external power can contain it. The EU's mockery was not simply a political mistake, it was a historic blunder. They had the chance to take him seriously, to adjust their policies, to acknowledge Africa's sovereignty. Instead, they chose ridicule, and ridicule turned into silence when the first cracks appeared in their control. The arrogance that once gave them confidence became the very chain that dragged them down. They believed the past guaranteed their future, but history does not honor arrogance, it honors change, and change had already begun. When the EU laughed at Traoré, they were not laughing at a man, they were laughing at the voice of Africa. And that laughter will echo as the sound of their own decline.